More than 300 Aramaic inscriptions have been found here, some in the Aramaic dialect of Hatra. Many are of great historical importance. Most of these inscriptions are now preserved in the Museum of Mosul and in Baghdad, together with statues and other relics found at the site. By the second half of the 5th century BC, Aramaic had become the most widespread language in Palestine, as everyday documents inscribed on pottery indicate. In 1947, at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, a Bedouin boy looking for a goat that had wandered off entered a cave untouched by time and stumbled upon what is probably the most important archaeological find ever made in the Holy Land: a terracotta jar containing the oldest group of scrolls ever discovered of biblical and non-biblical manuscripts. It was the first of a series of such scrolls that subsequently came to light in 11 caves, an unprecedented treasure that continues to fire the imagination and polarize the interest of scholars around the world. One of the first and best preserved of the scrolls contained the book of Isaiah, copied many centuries earlier than any other surviving manuscript of this book. The Isaiah scroll is written in Hebrew, but another one contains an Aramaic translation of the book of Job. From the Jordan to the Dead Sea, from Judea to Galilee to Samaria, from Syria to the Negev to Sinai, Aramaic was the language of the people, and therefore also the language of Jesus and the apostles. When he addressed the multitude in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke in Aramaic.
بريخين ايلين ادمسكينين ون بروح ادلهوني ملكوث ودشمايو بريخين نون ايلين دابلين دهينون نتبايون بريخين ايلين ادماكي خين دهينون نرثون لرعو.
After the death and resurrection of Jesus, the apostles and disciples who constituted the Church of Jerusalem went out into the world to spread the word of God, speaking the only language that they knew well, Aramaic.
So they left and preached everywhere, while the Lord went with them and confirmed the word with his great works.
Antioch, today Antakya, on the Orontes River, was the capital of the Roman province of Syria and the third most important city of the empire after Rome and Alexandria. No wonder that it was one of the first places visited by the messengers of the new religion. After consolidating his role as leader of the apostles, Peter lived there for a year with Paul and Barnabas, and together they gathered many converts. The inhabitants of Antioch were sometimes skeptical and often hostile, but here the church accepted non-Jewish converts, and for the first time its congregation became known as Christians. The echo of those days seems to permeate the air around the ancient church cave on the outskirts of the city, where it's believed that Peter preached when he was in Antioch with Paul. The Crusaders added the facade at a time when Antioch was an important Christian base in Syria, but the cave still looks as it did in its primitive state. Originally, it was owned by the evangelist Luke, a native of Antioch, who gave it to the Christians so that they could have their own place to meet and pray together. Today, it's impossible for Christians not to be overwhelmed by the emotion of being in a place that has been sacred since the dawning of their religion. For many tourists, the main attraction is the passage dug from the rock and used, according to tradition, to lead the faithful to safety in times of danger through a maze of inaccessible, overhanging caves. The cave church of St. Peter is still used. Pilgrims come here now and then to attend the solemn rites, unchanged by time, celebrated on special days, like the visit of the Patriarch to Antioch at the beginning of the 3rd millennium. For the most part, these pilgrims come from abroad, insofar as the local Christian community is now, unfortunately, almost non-existent. While the new religion was burgeoning in Antioch, another of the 12 apostles, Thomas the Doubter, set off across the ocean heading for India. After a long and hazardous voyage, he finally set foot on the subcontinent's southernmost shores. And so, thanks to Thomas the Apostle, the Church of Christ gained a foothold in that remote area. And with the church came the Aramaic language. In the place where tradition has it that the apostle first encountered the native people, some rabbis who came out to greet him, the scene is reconstructed with life-size models. Nearby are the remains of an ancient Hindu temple, transformed into a Christian church after the conversion of the local people to the gospel announced by Thomas. Centuries later, following in the apostles' steps, Christianity spread to the center of southern India and Asia along the Silk Route. More often than not, this expansion was accompanied by the spread of the Syriac language. A long Chinese Syriac inscription on a stele erected in Xi'an, in ancient times known as Xinyanfu in western China, bears witness to the arrival in 635 AD of a Syriac mission there. Additional evidence comes from a Syriac manuscript of the Gospel written with golden letters for a Mongol princess at the end of the 13th century that contains a portrait of the princess herself with her husband. Our quest to retrace the history of the Aramaeans takes us back to the biblical city of Haran in Upper Mesopotamia, one of the oldest centers of habitation in the world and the cradle of the Aramaean population, the land of Abraham.
And Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there.
This is Haran today. The current inhabitants are unaware of their Aramaean ancestry and barely remember the name of their biblical ancestor, even though he is rapidly becoming the town's main tourist attraction. Not far from Haran is Urfa, or Shanli Urfa, glorious Urfa as it is known today, a large city lost in the middle of nowhere, 50 kilometers from the Syrian border. Originally, it was known as Edessa, and it is steeped in history. Subject to the mysterious laws of military alchemy, great empires fought each other for centuries in this hot, dusty location that continued to be a theater of dispute between leading historical figures almost until the present day. The people who live here now are anything but aggressive. In the cool, relaxing park, pious Muslims gather to throw chickpeas to sacred carp. The fish are sacred because legend has it that at the funeral of the patriarch Abraham, who was a great prophet for the Muslims, the sparks from his pyre turned into carp when they hit the water. The entrance to the so-called Cave of Abraham is always crowded with pilgrims. According to a local legend that contradicts biblical history, this is the birthplace of the prophet Abraham, friend of God. Şanlıurfa is a melting pot of races and ancestries, Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and foreigners. The souk is emblematic of the ethnic mix. A cacophony of voices speaking in many different languages, but one is missing: Syriac, the Aramaic of the Syriac Christians who lived here for centuries. Two columns known as the Throne of Nimrod, the biblical founder of Edessa, stand out against the sky on the Kale, or fortress. On one of the columns, one can still see an inscription in Syriac recording the name of Queen Shalmat, who was a member of the local royal dynasty which established itself in Edessa in the late 2nd century BC, and whose line of kings lasted until the early 3rd century AD. It is said that Abgar VIII, known as the Great, converted to Christianity in the year 206 with the majority of his subjects, and thus the city became the world's first Christian kingdom. This is more legend than history, but it is very likely that the new religion reached Edessa at an early date, making it one of the most important centers of early Aramaic-speaking Christianity. As a result, its local Aramaic dialect, Syriac, became the language both of the Syrian Orthodox Church and of the other Syriac churches of the Middle East. Today, however, there are no signs of a Christian presence. The Christian population here, as in many other cities and villages of Upper Mesopotamia, was forced to migrate, or more precisely, to flee from the hatred and persecutions that, in 1915, even took on the characteristics of genocide. The last Christian communities left in 1924, spurred on by the massacres, and took with them all they were able to save from the dismantling of their churches: furniture, relics, holy books. Everything was transferred to nearby Aleppo in Syria, where they were warmly welcomed and have been able to continue professing their faith in peace. That's why traces of the early Christian community of Edessa can be found in St. George's Church in Aleppo. In the atrium, a modern bas-relief depicts the Aramaean king of Edessa, Abgar V, known as the Black, who reigned many years before Abgar the Great. The king is depicted gazing at a linen sheet bearing the image of Christ. Tradition has it that Abgar the Black admired Jesus' miracles and sent a messenger asking him to come and heal a terrible illness from which he was suffering. Jesus answered that as soon as he ascended to heaven, he would send the king one of his disciples. When the messenger returned, he showed the king the effigy of Christ that Jesus himself had miraculously impressed onto a linen sheet, and the king was healed. Three keys are required to open the safe that contains the still intact holy books that belong to the Edessa community. Lay members of the church keep 2 of the keys, and the bishop keeps the 3rd. Among the precious manuscripts in the safe is the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, Mor Mikoyel Rabo, dating from 1199 AD. SYRIAC became the literary language of all Christians of Aramaean descent, both in the Eastern Empire and, farther east, in the Sassanid Empire. SYRIAC had its own translation of the Bible, the Peshitta, still used today. And in the course of centuries, SYRIAC has generated a vast amount of literature by many important authors. Saint Ephrem of Nisibin, in particular, is one of the greatest poets of the early church. It was he who coined the phrase, the hidden pearl, to describe the Christian message.
حد من يوم مرقونيثو شقلث آحي حزيت بهروزي بني ملكوثو يقني وتفصي دهوي رابوثو هوتلو معينو وشتي ثمينو روزا ودبرو في قدامي ملكوثو دشنايو المرقونيثو
صمتوه أحاي عال فساد إيد تباقي بوه إزيد دحزيه من حد قبو هوت لوه أفي من كول جابين بصوته دبرو دلو متدرخد كولوه نهروي ري قدامي ملكوتو دشمايو مرقونيتو
بهاي شفيوتو حزيت الشفيو دلوم الدلح وابدا خيوتو روزو رابو فغرد موران ضم صالالو بلو فولوهو حزيت القشتو دلوم تفالخ بريخ قدامي ملكوتو دشمايو المرقونيتو.
These Aleppo school children are reciting one of St. Ephrem's poems. It is as though their voices have crossed the border into Turkey, traveling to their ancestral home of Nisibin in search of the memory of Mor Ephrem the Syrian. Mor in Aramaic means Lord, Monsignor, or Saint. Until a short time ago, here in Nisibin, known today as Nusaybin, an inscription was to be found on the walls of this church, recording the date 359 AD, which means that Saint Ephrem himself might have seen it being built, since he was still living in Nisibin at the time. We searched for the inscription in vain in the church dedicated to Saint Jacob of Nisibin, another great Syriac saint that welcomed us in the empty silence of its splendid desolation. In Aleppo's new cathedral, one of the countless Syrian Orthodox churches dedicated to Saint Ephrem, the remarkable modern frescoes are influenced by the rich Syriac culture, whose greatest figures were Bardaisan, known as the Aramaean philosopher who died in 222 AD, the poets Balai, Narsai, and Jacob of Seruj, along with authors such as John the Solitary, Philoxenus of Mabuch, Sergius of Rishaina, and John of Ephesus, all belonging to the 5th and 6th centuries, followed in the 7th century by such men as Severus Sabocht, Jacob of Edessa, and Isaac of Nineveh, or Isaac the Syrian. These were followed in later centuries by great scholars such as Mushe bar Kifo, Dionysius bar Salibi, the patriarch Michael the Great, and culminating in the polymath Gregorius bar Ebroio in the 13th century. Included among these illustrious figures, naturally, is Saint Ephrem. Late antiquity, especially from the 3rd to the 5th centuries, was a period of hermits, ascetics, and monks. The remote, often inaccessible places that these mad followers of God inhabited seem impossibly inhospitable to us in the 21st century. These men cut themselves off intentionally from the rest of the world, and the only way to find traces of them is by following goat tracks. This is Wadi Kadisha, the Lebanese Holy Valley, where there are many remains of Syriac monasteries and hermit dwellings that blossomed during that age of great mystical fervor. However, these men, who were commonly referred to as the recluses, did not embrace a life of extreme sacrifice out of an abstract love of God, an elitist need for isolation, or an egotistical life of contemplation. In 313 AD, the Edict of Constantine sanctioned the end of the persecutions and marked the beginning of freedom of worship for Christians. Being a Christian was no longer synonymous with imprisonment, torture, and death. But many members of the Church yearned to belong to the world of martyrdom of the early Christians. They yearned to be martyrs themselves, determined to sacrifice their lives in order to bear witness of their faith. This is why they made their heroic choice and subjected themselves to what was widely considered absurd hardship and deprivation. A hermit monk wishing to found a monastery would choose a cave big enough to contain a church. The presence of a freshwater spring nearby was indispensable. For several years, such a monk would live alone in the cave, praying and awaiting the arrival of fellow monks who would join him of their own free will, together with others who responded to his invitation. When the group was big enough, everyone worked together to build the church. Subsequently, the monastery would be built. Each monk was assigned his own cave, some accessible only by rope or ladder, in which he lived a life of prayer and solitude until the end of his days. Every Sunday, the monks gathered in the monastery to take the Eucharist, to receive orders from their superior, and to collect a ration of bread, water, and oil. Each monk might also have had a goat to provide milk and cheese. When they were old or ill, monks too weak to reach the monastery would be assigned younger monks who would see to their needs and nurse them until their final hour.